Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us in the third and final session of our sub-series in Why Marx on Marx and democracy. Tonight we're looking specifically at how the Paris Commune changed the views of Marx and Engels, of course, on the question of democracy. We're going to have two speakers tonight. Kevin will start off just giving a quick overview of that sub-series so far, to go through briefly how the views of Marx and Engels on democracy changed over the decades. And then Luke will give the main presentation. Without further ado, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Good evening, comrades. This is the third in a series of sessions that Luke and I and Steve Freeman have contributed to in the last about month or so ago, it seems now. And we're looking at how Marx and Engels' ideas on the idea of democracy, and particularly its relationship to communism, developed over a historic period, particularly from the 1840s, culminating in the 1870s, the Paris Commune, and in some of the developments in the years after that. Both Marx and Engels began as radical democrats. They began as radical philosophers, and particularly looking at the nature of contemporary society, and indeed what they saw as the sort of disjuncture or the difference between the ideals of democracy and the reality of the society they're living in, a society in which capitalism was developing. And in particular, the way that the promises of the French Revolution and radical democracy had failed really to bring about democracy, equality, all of the promises of that revolution. And we began by looking at that development in the 1840s, where Marx and Engels both moved from radical democracy towards communism, in particular, looking at not only the way that their ideas had become radical, much more radical, but also the way that they saw property relations. And above all, the idea that the new society of communism was immanent in the old, that capitalism was producing the conditions and indeed the class, the new universal class. Now, this initially was a philosophical debate, and again, we touched on there the various philosophical works, which again, comrades will be familiar with, but I'm not sure that enough comrades, I mean, in the general sense, read or look at the impact that these early philosophical ideas had on Marx and Engels' politics. Particularly the idea that it isn't just simply ideals and utopian ideas that are the way that history is made, but through political action. And in particular, that the lived experience of the movement and the living movement, the actions of men and women as well in society, are the way that society changes. Now, this led, I think, in the late 1840s to a much closer political engagement, and particularly Engels' experience in Britain with the Chartist movement, which of course he wrote extensively about, passed on to other comrades in Europe, but also the idea of trying to turn these ideas into some sort of political movement. And from this we get one of the most sort of famous documents of Marxism, document I would think that most people have read, probably their first reading, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And this appeared within a few days of the outbreak of the 1848 revolutions, which we looked at last week. And those revolutions those revolutions occurred throughout Europe, and they were in general revolutions against absolutist regimes which had very limited democracy, in fact, no real democracy at all, which there was often national and social oppressions. And these movements often took the form of movements against absolute monarchies, and they were, in a sense, attempts to replicate the French Revolution. And Marx and Engels were intimately involved in this movement, particularly in Cologne, in the Rhineland, which was then under the control of Prussia, one of the more reactionary monarchies in Germany, but also in other parts of Germany as well. So the 1848 revolutions were a sort of testing ground for Marx's ideas, and indeed in extensive literature, particularly the newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He developed his political ideas, Engels likewise, but also through addressing meetings, writing pamphlets, and developing a political program in action. The one document that's often, I think, rather overlooked, but is an agitational document which occurs in this period, is one that Marx wrote called The Demands of the Communist Party in Germany. And these centered democracy, in particular the idea of the united, indivisible democratic republic, and in particular stressed the relationship between democracy and the struggle for communism, and in particular the importance of politicizing that struggle and developing a political movement to carry out both the fight for democracy, but also the fight for communism. So these were actual practical questions for Marx and Engels in this revolution. In following the defeat of those revolutions, which they played an active part, Marx and Engels were in exile in Britain, and they began to reevaluate what had happened. A number of documents, again, which I referred to last time, particularly the two addresses to the Communist League, in which they set forward a number of lessons, in particular, the role of the bourgeoisie, the failure of the bourgeoisie to carry forward the democratic revolutions, and indeed an argument that the bourgeoisie in Germany and elsewhere was in fact unable to carry out those democratic tasks. It was, not only was it cowardly, but it saw its interests as being diametrically opposed to the proletariat. And indeed, as Marx had argued as early as the 1840s, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat both come into existence at the same time. So the class that would in the previous round of bourgeois revolutions would have carried out that revolution now has another class that is in a sense the hangman, is the gravedigger, all the various phrases that we know. So they were being created together, and of course they were in antithesis to each other. The period after the 1848 revolutions is also a period in which Marx looks at practical politics, in particular the need for independent working class organization, for no trust in the bourgeoisie, and in particular for the idea of the proletariat and the working class movement to be the leading force in the struggle for democracy and for communism. This means that other classes, for example, the petty bourgeoisie, the peasantry in those countries which had predominantly agricultural populations, could be part of the revolutionary movement, but they would still require the leadership and the cutting edge, as it were, of the proletariat, the only true revolutionary and indeed universal class. Now, between 1848 and the Paris Commune that Luke is going to talk about this evening, a number of quite important developments occur. And these are both political in the sense of world politics, European politics, but also organizationally. And the two that I would just focus on, I'm sure Luke will allude to them, are of course the American Civil War and the various national movements that are emerging in Europe for national unification and for democracy. And of course in Britain as well, the Reform League with its demands for forms of manhood suffrage, extension of the right to vote to wider sections of the population. Organizationally, we have the creation of the International Working Men's Association in 1864. And again, its address sets forward many of the political lessons that Marx had been enunciating, the idea of independent working class organization, separation from the bourgeoisie, but also that key demand that the emancipation of the working class should be the job, the function of the working class, that it wouldn't be through social reform, it wouldn't be through forms of enlightened ruler, or indeed, as was then becoming debated in Germany, forms of labor dictator or labor monarchist, such as argued for by Lassalle. So on the eve of the Paris Commune, the First International was a strong organization with a clear political presence, and indeed was noted as having such by the various bourgeois press throughout Europe. And that force, I think, is going to come into play during the Paris Commune. So questions of democracy, its relationship to the struggle for socialism, and the idea of independent working class organization had all been, I think, discussed and clearly enunciated throughout the 1850s and 60s by Marx. But the Paris Commune, as with 1848, was to give Marx a living experience of worker struggle, and in particular forms of democracy. So again, it was an attempt to take from that experience theoretical lessons and then extend them into the ideas of what a government, a democratic government, a working class government should be. But I've done enough to set the scene, so I will now hand over to Luke. I'll come back at the end and maybe make a few observations or questions to frame the discussion, but I'm sure comrades will have plenty to talk about after Luke's presentation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's a very useful setting the scene, so to speak. Over to you, Luke. I think you're doing a screen share, aren't you?
Okay. Trust this is okay.
Yep.
So thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks Kevin for the introduction. As was mentioned, I'm going to start us off at the period of the Paris Commune in 1871, and then I'm going to take us forward a little bit here. What I'm starting off with is a picture of the cannons in the top of Montmartre, which the taking of the cannons, or the attempted taking of the cannons by the French government under Adolphe Thiers, was one of the events that kind of kicked off the Paris Commune. So I thought this was a fun little way. Also maybe a fun little way because Kevin shared some early photography with us in his first presentation, and here we have another one of these early photographs. So this is a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to focus on some key texts, and then I'll bring us up to a little bit of the present moment, going through history. I'm going to start by talking about the Civil War in France, which was a series of addresses that Marx wrote and then were combined into a very influential work. The perhaps less known conspective of Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy, Marx's reflections on a piece that Bakunin wrote. Then the perhaps better known critique of the Gotha program, and then the critique of the Erfurt program. I'll then bring us up to the point of the Prussian suffrage debates, which are happening after Marx and Engels have both died. Talk a little bit about this idea of the Democratic Republic as a slogan, and how that goes hand in glove a little bit with the ideas of the minimum program and where that's gone. Because I think, as we've discussed maybe in the beginning of this presentation, the idea of Marxism and democracy, Marxism and the Democratic Republic, can sound a little strange in our ears. And so questioning why that is and why that might be the case. And then I'll give a few comments, I think, on democracy and Marxism. So as Kevin alluded to, we stand in a particular position by 1871, and Kevin has likely touched on most of these points, but just to reinforce them, after 1848, we have this recognition that the bourgeoisie are no longer a force for democracy, and that in their place stand the proletariat, who can and must fight independently for political power. We also have a recognition that democracy needs a state form that can ensure political and social freedom. So it's one thing to have the ideas or the philosophy, so to speak, but that needs to be made material. Perhaps you could borrow a phrase from Marx and talk about making the world philosophical in that sense, which just means to make these ideas concrete and in the lives of actual folks. And to do that, you need a state form and a political structure. So we have allusions already to this idea of the state being smashed or somehow done away with. We also have more explicit allusions to the idea of the working class winning the battle of democracy. But the question is, well, what does this actually look like? What does this materially look like? And as Kevin also mentioned, some of these demands are made in the demands of the Communist Party in Germany. And so it's interesting, as someone like myself who was only familiar, for example, with the Civil War in France and what Marx says in the Civil War in France, to look back and actually see a lot of these ideas were not formed in 1871. And I think we can actually question, to what extent those ideas were brand new in that moment. And again, it goes in hand in glove with our project of kind of tracing the development of these ideas and understanding how none of them kind of came out of the blue, so to speak. And then we have in 1848 the demand for a social republic. We have the idea, the slogan. Marx points out that this was a slogan put out by folks, by the fighting working class in 1848. But it has yet to become concrete in a certain sense. Where is the living example of that idea? Where will these ideas be tested, as Kevin alluded to? And it just so happens that those ideas are put to the test. The example is found in the Paris Commune of 1871. And I take this point here from Richard Hunt, who wrote a two-part work on the ideas of Marx and Engels. And he acknowledges the fact that if you're looking for an exact historical record of the events of the Paris Commune, you would learn a lot from the writings of Marx, but you would also be relying on an insufficient source. But I think he makes a good point, which is that the more Marx and Engels might have idealized the commune or emphasized certain aspects of it, the more they're revealing their own desire for what the future state would look like. So the aspects that they're hyping up, that they're really playing onto, those are the things I think we can say that make Marx excited. And because it makes him excited, we can say, okay, these are what he's looking for, what he's latching onto. So I'm going to talk a little bit then about the Paris Commune, bringing in some quotes from folks. So Marx talks about how the state in its commune form and during the Paris Commune is given a revolutionary and transient form. And this, I think, mirrors something that Engels said in his introduction to the work a little while later, where he says, the state is at best, to paraphrase, the state is at best an evil inherited by the working class, which must have its worst aspects, that being the bureaucracy and the army, lopped off. So I bring this up to give a little context to the idea that none of this ever devolves into or changes into state worship, so to speak. We are never losing the aspect of Marx's communism that sees the state as a transient object in human society. We should never lose sight of the fact when we talk about democracy or the democratic republic that these are ends in themselves, so to speak. So I'll bring in a few quotes here. These are all from Marx's work, The Civil War in France. He talks about how the communal constitution was to restore to the social body all the forces hitherto absorbed by the state parasite, feeding upon and clogging the free movement of society. So in the Civil War in France, I think we see some allusions, I won't necessarily say returns, but allusions to some of the more, I hesitate to say abstract or maybe Hegelian influenced language that Marx uses in the beginning of his development as a communist that we talked about in our first session. And this idea that there is a social body that can be free and active, but is in some way dominated or interfered with by the state apparatus. And it's interesting, this allusion to the state feeding upon and clogging the free movement of society in Capital, Marx talks about the not the parasitic, the vampiric quality of capital, I believe he says, which feeds on the working class. So we're very much aware of this idea of parasitism and the vampire-like qualities, taking something, feeding off of something in regards to capitalism in general. But we have that same aspect here when discussing the state and the state that stands over and dominates society. We also have reference here, the commune was the political form under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. This is again from the Civil War in France. And I think here we have further evidence of this idea that the revolution would be a two-part process, and that it's the seizure of political power that comes first and is essentially the primary task of the working class. When political power is taken under a certain political form, it's at that point, or under which then one can work out the economic emancipation of labor. There's going to be another quote that says this in a different way. And here it is, that the commune form would serve as a lever for uprooting the economic foundations upon which rest the existence of classes and class rule. So when discussing democracy, the democratic republic, there's always this idea of tasks to be done first and foremost, I think, and that's only from a position of political power, from a position of state power, that one can, I really like this this illusion, almost as if you're digging under a tree with your shovel, so to speak, that you can dig under and then push up and uproot the economic foundation. So I have here, it might be a little distorted on my screen, a chart from Bruno Leopold's work on Marx's republicanism. And this is essentially Leopold taking what Marx talks about in the Civil War in France and putting them into what I consider a handy dandy little chart. And I won't spend too much time on this point, but he's making concrete some of these ideas. So when it comes to the commune, we have combined executive and legislative body. We have members elected by universal suffrage. When it comes to public administration, we have public officials elected and subject to recall. We have public officials paid working men's wages. When it comes to the established church, we have clergy who are removed from public roles. We have education made free and independent of the church. When it comes to the national structure, there's this idea that rural communes will send delegates to a district assembly in a central town. So there's a structure of power here that kind of flows upwards. And that there is still an understanding or some kind of balance between independence and concentration of power. So central governments exercise remaining functions not carried out by local and regional communes. And as I've alluded to, I think in a different talk, there was a plan to make this commune form something that could be expanded to cover the entirety of France. It never reached that point, but in these points here for the national structure, I think we can see that. And then very importantly, and something that I think can be considered almost the litmus test for the extent to which the state is a worker state, are the forces of physical repression. So is the standing army replaced by a people's militia? If there are police, are they depoliticized and subject to recall? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about, the ability of the state to kind of react with brute force. And then just as crucially, that judges are elected and subject to recall. So from the top down, we have this entrance of society through these measures into the state, making the state subordinate. So when Marx talks about democracy or the importance of democracy in the democratic republic, that idea is made concrete here in these policies, in these measures. So I'm going to go through and read a few more quotes on the commune before moving on a little bit. So Engels writes that it's against this transformation of the state and the organs of the state from servants of society into masters of society, an inevitable transformation in all previous states, that the Commune made use of two infallible means. In the first place, it filled all posts, administrative, judicial, and educational, by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, subject to the right of recall at any time by the same electors. And in the second place, all officials, high and low, were paid only the wages received by other workers. So I basically set up then, what I already talked about. And that in this way, an effective barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up. Marx talks about how the whole sham of state mysteries and state pretensions were done away with, mostly consisting of simple working men filling all the posts hitherto divided between government, police, and prefecture, doing their work publicly, simply, under the most difficult and complicated circumstances, and doing it for a few pounds, acting in bright daylight with no pretensions to infallibility, making in one order the public functions real working men's functions instead of the hidden attributes of a trained caste. So we can think about how much of our existing state work goes on behind closed doors and is done by a trained caste. And I contend that it's by doing away with that aspect of it, by exposing the state and the state functions to daylight, so to speak, and getting rid of that trained caste, that we actually have a very concrete way, not a complete way, but a very concrete way of smashing the state when Marx talks about smashing the state. Marx also writes that the judicial functionaries were to be divested of that sham independence, which had but served to mask their subservience to all succeeding governments to which they'd taken and broken the oath of allegiance. And then, like the rest of public servants, magistrates and judges were to be elective, responsible, and revocable. So I'll turn now to the perspective of Bakunin statism and anarchy. This is written by Marx just about 4 years after the Civil War in France. And this is a work that I didn't know much about prior to reading it for this presentation. But it's interesting because it's Marx reflecting on what Bakunin has written. And Bakunin is especially or essentially expressing anxieties, I think, or concerns, or just out and out disagreements with what Marx thinks the possibilities for democracy are. So Bakunin asks, more or less, who does the working class rule over? And he contends, well, there must be another working class. If the working class rules, well, then they must be ruling over another working class. And there's an acknowledgement by Marx that so long as other classes exist and the working class struggles with them, the working class employs coercive means, that is, governmental means. So as long as classes exist, there would be a state, the difference being that it's a worker state, the form of the democratic republic. There's also a reflection on the aspect of the peasantry that Kevin and other folks have alluded to in this period, and will come up, in later historical struggles, that the workers' government will have to win the peasantry to its side, unless it kind of wrecks another revolution, as he says. And Marx is saying, in regards to Bakunin's anxieties, that there will be a division of political power in the democratic republic. Certain people will have certain jobs that others don't. And at least in the beginning, certain people will have careers even, or will be asked to do one thing more often than another person. But that this power, and it is power, doesn't inherently lead to tyranny, as Bakunin says. And I think we see why it doesn't inherently lead to tyranny if we look at the measures that we just talked about in regards to the Paris Commune. So there are concerns about having a division of power in the democratic republic, but it's the policies of that state that address those issues and that make it actually a democratic republic. I'll move in now to a little bit of the critique of the Gotha program. The critique of the Gotha program is maybe a better known text. It's Marx, but Engels is there as well. They're basically reacting to a proposed program that will take place between two socialist groups in Germany, one of them being who are referred to as the Eisenachers, considered kind of more Marxist in their outlook, and the other being a group not led by Lassalle, who Lassalle is dead at this point, but who's seen as more under the influence of Lassallean ideas. And the importance here is to think of Lassallean ideas as being I hesitate to say uncritical, but an acceptance of using the state as the state exists, even if it means, working with the king against the bourgeoisie, so to speak, and some other things. So some of the ideas that Marx latches onto and that I think are relevant for our topic is what I present here. The first being this idea of a free state. And the Gotha program presents the possibility or a desire of creating a free state. And when I first read this, I think it was through the lens maybe more of Engels and the critique of this being, well, if a state exists, that means there are classes, and therefore no one is really free in a certain sense. So, okay, that's one route we can interpret this statement of a free state. What's more interesting, and I think more relevant to our conversation, is Marx's concern that the state would be free in the sense of standing over and dominating society. We've seen exactly how hard Marx is working and how much pleasure he takes in seeing the Paris Commune to see the state not being free. The state is expressly subordinate to society, to the working class, to the masses. And it's through the democratic republic that the state is made not free. The people who work in the state are made not free. The bureaucrats are not free. The political representatives are not free. They are subordinate to the dictates of the masses through the policies that are put in place. Another thing that Marx talks about is that there are demands that are made in the Gotha program that are democratic. He has some interesting things to say about them, but he points out essentially that there's a contradiction between the existing state, which he refers to as a police state, and those democratic demands. And he essentially says that the Lassalleans, under the influence of Lassalle, are mistaken, because if you can't demand the republic, then don't demand anything democratic, essentially. So you can't enact democratic demands in this police state, right? There's an overarching structure that makes these democratic demands impossible. So don't sow illusions that could be otherwise. And this is going to come up again in the reading that I'll talk about next. But that one has to kind of get to the root of the state form, so to speak, before one talks about, changing various aspects of it. And then one thing that's interesting to consider is that Marx refers to a lot of very democratic demands as old, familiar democratic litany. And I think we can question to what extent Marx is either mistaken or he's kind of contradicting himself in the Gotha program when he kind of dismisses some of these demands that are made. I say contradictory because we can look at later works, particularly the program of the Parti Ouvrier, the French party, that have an endorsement of these very things that here he is kind of poo-pooing, so to speak. So not everything is consistent, and at some points, demands are seen as irrelevant or not useful, and at other points, they're embraced. So that brings us to the critique of the Erfurt program. It's at this point that Marx has died, and so this is Engels critiquing the Erfurt program, and there's a whole history around the Gotha program and the importance that will play in so much of social democracy leading up to the First World War and even after the First World War. And then also what Engels' critique of the Erfurt program is, how that is handled by the Social Democratic Party's leadership and how it's edited and so forth. But I think it's interesting that Engels makes essentially the same point that Marx makes in regards to the critique of the Gotha program, which is that the Social Democratic Party of Germany is mistaken to make demands that they seem to allude to being able to happen in Prussia. This is a police state, as Engels said. Don't fool yourself again, and to think that these demands could actually be implemented without the democratic republic. And he alludes to perhaps it being a sign of opportunism to think that the working class could come to power within a police state like Prussia, right? Or that the working class could come to power through the Reichstag, through the current state, that one could realize real democratic change. And the reason one can't do that is because it is not a democratic republic. And then it's interesting, of course, to note that Lenin does not make this mistake in regards to the Duma. He expressly states the Duma cannot bring us to power. And, you know, the consistent opposition to that state form or to that body is something that leads the Russian Social Democratic Party to success. And then Engels says quite explicitly that the working class can only come to power under the democratic republic, and that democratic demands are well and good, but in the Erfurt program, they do not equal what is most needed. They do not equal the democratic republic, and that this is the great flaw, as he says, of the Erfurt program. Again, that all these little things coming together, put them together, they do not equal the democratic republic. And without that, you know, you don't have, again, that lever, that shovel, so to speak, that one can dig down and then change so much of society. So the Erfurt program and the Gotha program come up again in an interesting debate that takes place in 1910 around Prussian suffrage. And this brings in some history and the personalities of Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg. I'm sure some of us, maybe myself, have alluded to the fact that many years prior, Karl Kautsky had stated that democracy is the light and air of the working class, which is a very good statement and an often repeated statement. But it's at this point that that is put to the test, so to speak. And what develops is an irreconcilable split between Kautsky and Luxemburg over this issue of the democratic republic, in which Luxemburg talks about the democratic republic in some of her articles, and Kautsky censors it, essentially. And it's interesting to note that Kautsky uses Marx and Engels as an authority on this by saying, look, Marx and Engels said we shouldn't demand the democratic republic in the Gotha program and in the Erfurt program. And Rosa Luxemburg responds saying, well, that was in a particular context. And when they were saying, you know, for example, Marx in the Gotha program don't demand the democratic republic, he was saying if it would be better to not make these demands than sow illusions in the fact that they could be implemented without the democratic republic, essentially. You know, don't paint the picture of our society being a democratic republic, you know, and then sow illusions in that way. And Rosa Luxemburg's response in her article, Theory and Practice, to Karl Kautsky is very powerful, and I'm just going to quote a bit from that here. And so Rosa Luxemburg writes that it's because the 40-year labor of social democracy has been such a fundamental prophylaxis against the dangers of Republican petty bourgeois illusions in Germany that today we can calmly make a place in our agitation for the foremost principle of our political program, a place that is its due by right. By pushing forward the Republican character of social democracy, we win, above all, one more opportunity to illustrate in a palpable, popular fashion our principled opposition as a class party of the proletariat to the united camp of all bourgeois parties. So Kautsky expressed anxiety earlier that, well, if we demand a democratic republic, the working class is going to interpret that as a bourgeois republic. They're going to have bourgeois illusions, so to speak, in what's going on, and they'll be duped in that way. And Luxemburg makes the point of, no, you know, it's because we've been so principled up to this point that when we talk about a democratic republic, our working class is going to know what we mean by a democratic republic. So I'll start heading towards the finish line here, because I think it's interesting to think about what happened to the demand for a democratic republic after Marx and Engels' death. And tied in with that is then the fate of the minimum program after 1914, because historically it's in the minimum section of the minimum maximum program in which the demands, the political demands that would create the democratic republic have been made. And it's actually not just at 1914 that folks start to lose faith in the possibility of the minimum maximum program ever leading towards the maximum program. It's earlier than that. And more research I think needs to be done, or I need to do more reading on it. But it's interesting to see that anxiety starts to arise around the radical nature of the minimum program, around the radical nature of the democratic republic, an anxiety I think that's still very much with us today, pretty early on in the history of the socialist movement. And I note here that the demand for a democratic republic essentially disappears. It appears in the program of the Socialist Party of America in 1912. Trotsky makes a few references, or that is a few demands towards a democratic republic when he's writing about France in the 30s. But at a certain point, it essentially disappears. Though I think, as I've already pointed out, it's interesting to note that it already wasn't present in the Erfurt program, this very important document. And then we can find various points in history. And, I point to one, the Spartacus program that Luxemburg pens right before her death in 1918, in which the minimum maximum program is explicitly pushed aside, and in which Luxemburg writes explicitly, we are creating our program in opposition to the minimum maximum program. Look where it got us, essentially. And that what we don't need now, and this should be taken in context, of course, in a period that seems like socialism is imminent, in a period that seems like revolution can happen now, what we don't need are democratic demands. Those are somehow not revolutionary enough. So I'm not faulting Luxemburg in any way, but I'm bringing up this idea of when things seem necessary, when socialism seems necessary, it's interesting to notice how democracy somehow then gets labeled as insufficient or inherently reformist or bourgeois. And I worry then that today, if we keep up that same mindset, that we're essentially throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, that we find ourselves in a situation where democracy and the demand for a democratic republic are not good enough, and only the whole project of socialism is good enough, or the whole goal of communism is good enough, and that leaves us paralyzed in a certain sense, without an understanding of how to get from point A to point C, but that we don't have to be paralyzed because we see the demand for a democratic republic at point B, so to speak, the dictatorship of the proletariat, as that middle period. So I'll just wrap up by going over briefly what I see are some important parts of the democratic republic. So no separation of powers, all political rights extended to the armed forces if the standing army is not out and out abolished, and political rights in the workplace, all officials being elected and controlled, that public life is as much as possible deprofessionalized, that we have the universal, equal, and direct suffrage of the population. And as I said, that the state is subordinate to society, and that it's under these conditions that the working class can win the class war, right? The class struggle does not end. Capitalism does not end under the dictatorship of the proletariat, but everything is brought up to a higher level once the working class takes that political power. And it's only once it has that political power under the form of the democratic republic that it actually has the possibility of winning the class war and actually realizing communism. So I'll wrap up here with a thought. I spoke with someone recently about Marx and democracy, and their comment to me was, well, don't you know that Marx had a critique of democracy? And I thought about that, and I thought, well, at one time I would have responded that by saying, yeah, that's true. Democracy isn't good enough for Marx. But then I thought about it, and I think actually what's more important to understand here is that The only problem Marx actually has with democracy is when there's too little democracy. So when he's talking about bourgeois democracy, for example, he's not throwing democracy out of the picture. He's saying democracy is not yet sufficient as political democracy. It also has to be social democracy. It has to extend towards all aspects of life. But if Marx has a problem with democracy, I contend that it's only when it's too little democracy. And then, as I talked about, yes, we can imagine a time when democracy as a state form will disappear as class society disappears. And I will end finally with this nice quote by Engels, who says at the very end of his life, well, a few years before the end of his life, he says, Marx and I for 40 years repeated ad nauseum that for us, the democratic republic is the only political form in which the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class can first be universalized and then culminate in the decisive victory of the proletariat. So here we have Engels 3 years before he dies saying, look, this is what we've repeated time and time again. And with that, I'll end my presentation and turn it over to you all.
Thank you very much, Luke. Very interesting thoughts there. I mean, we didn't just talk about the Paris Commune, as comrades have noticed, but we used that as the starting point to look at the development of Marx and Engels at the Paris Commune and beyond. Kevin, you want to say something more on this?
Well, it's just really just to ask Luke to elucidate a couple of points, but I won't go on for very long because I'm sure other comrades want to come in. The first one is something you touched on in the end there about the importance of democracy to Marx, and in particular the importance of democracy and the idea of transition, and in particular the transitory nature of the state. I think I wonder if you could talk a little more about that, particularly because there are differing views on the dictatorship of the proletariat, which I think is going to come up as a future session in these talks and discussions. But it's the idea that the state is not either a permanent form or indeed is in the sense it being a repressive body, a repressive structure, that it's actually a necessary form. And I'm thinking back to the real beginnings when Marx is, grappling with the Hegelian idea that the state bureaucracy is the universal class and that the state represents society as a whole, and indeed is a way, I think, of resolving contradictions in society. I think that idea still seems quite strong, certainly in parts of Europe and in what we might think of as classic social democracy. I mean post-1914 social democracy. So I just wondered if you could perhaps develop that and how you see that.
Sure. Well, just as you said, I think that's a very important part of Marx's interaction with Hegel and the state, this idea of, can the bureaucracy be this kind of universal transformative class in a certain sense? And Marx saying, no, it is going to be the working class. What I'll say, though, is that that doesn't mean that Marx ditches the idea that in a transitional period towards communism, that there will be divisions of power and divisions of responsibility, and that what makes the bureaucracy insufferable, so to speak, what makes them a bureaucrat, almost by even our standard definitions today, is that they are a class of itself, essentially. They have certain privileges, they are protected, they operate behind closed doors, and that the bureaucracy essentially ends when those privileges and that separation goes away. And that one can say that actually a big part of the class character of the state also is eroded, and I would go as far as to say smashed, when that separation from society is also done away with. I stand behind the idea that the democratic republic, the state form that's laid out in the chart, to some extent that I put up there on the board within the Paris Commune, is the state form that the working class would need in order to impose its will, majoritarian will, over the minority of the capitalist class and positions, in opposition to democratic rule, and that it's only through that form that we can begin the process. And I know that the idea of beginning and not, kind of getting there really quick, I think can rub the wrong way a little bit. But that's how I see it. I see it as us needing to start from a position of beginning, and that to do that, we need a state form in which the working class rules and that is subordinate to society. If not, we risk, another elite, another power force just coming and taking power.
And then just one last sort of brief point. You said that the Paris Commune was maybe Marx's understanding of democracy in the Paris Commune had grown out of his earlier politics, and that maybe it was not such a break. I just wonder if you could develop that. I'm thinking particularly of the importance of recall and accountability, and particularly the idea of the measures to prevent state bureaucracy, and those seem to me to be some of the the key features of the commune, and particularly they're put into practice. And I've always regarded those as sort of new features, but I wonder again whether there are earlier experiences, and maybe some of the direct democracy of the French Revolution, which again the commune sort of mimics in various ways but takes forward, whether that's any sort of model.
Yeah, well, I still have yet, I think, to fully work this out, because as I might have talked about, when I learned about the Paris Commune, it was seen or presented as something radically new in a certain sense, completely not in the realm of Marx's thought, and that's best kind of encapsulated by him changing, or I don't know if it was him or Engels, but adding, one of the few changes to the manifesto by saying, well, the commune proves to us that the state form needs to be smashed. And I'm not so sure that actually Marx and Engels first learned that lesson by looking at the events of the Paris Commune. And I back that up just by thinking about some of the demands of, the party in Germany in 1848 that have a lot of these Republican features in them in terms of accountability and whatnot. And then also Marx's interest in the 50s, I believe, around constitutions and looking at the constitutions of so-called bourgeois democracies, and essentially saying these are all the ways in which their democracy is insufficient. So I think there is this long-running interest in looking at the state and critiquing it from this perspective of what are the structures, are they sufficiently democratic to the extent at which the state is subordinate to society. And in every case, he looks at these states and finds them lacking, except then when he sees what takes place in the Paris Commune.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to move away now. There's plenty of discussion going on, and I'm sure other comrades want to come in.
I was going to ask you both, actually, maybe for a bit of clarification. I mean, Engels, I understand, called the Paris Commune an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. When he I think on the 20th anniversary of the Paris Commune. So the relationship between the democratic republic and the dictatorship of the proletariat, is it the same thing, or is the democratic republic the form or the transition you needed to get to the stage where you can have a dictatorship of the proletariat, or is it really the same thing? Because they both are transitionary stages, really, aren't they?
Yeah, for me, it's the same thing. I think if you look at the Paris Commune, it is a democratic republic, and therefore you can almost read Engels as saying, here's the commune, it's the state, it's the dictatorship of the proletariat. We ask ourselves, well, what is the commune? It has the structure of a democratic republic.
What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I would agree, except I would add one, not proviso, but I would argue that the working class coming to power in a democratic republic would have revolutionary implications. And what we're not seeing, I think, is a sort of smooth, gradual, orderly pattern. It's a revolutionary pattern. And so it's not just that the democratic republic is sort of picked up and developed. It will be probably, or as it was in the Paris Commune, and indeed in other examples, it will be carried out under revolutionary conditions. So it won't simply be a constitution that's being developed in that way. So I would see them in that way, but I would look at the context and the conditions under which the working class would come to power in that republic. So it isn't, I think, just a series of elections and getting majorities. And that is probably one of the, perhaps that contextual issue is what's left out in some readings of German social democrats, which move into a reformist direction.
I also think it's hugely important. Sorry, comrade. I'll bring it back in a second. That we fill, if we work in the Marxist tradition, that we fill the concept of democratic republic, because people will hear democratic republic and they think, well, that's just like, Germany is a democratic republic, Sweden, they don't have a monarchy. But, I think you outlined very well, Luke, what it actually meant for Marx and Engels. It's an entirely different system with recallability, accountability, division of church and state, the people's militia. I mean, that's the crucial point, perhaps, having a people's militia and all these kind of hugely democratic measures in place. Back to you, Luke.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and that is exactly what was done with Engels' a critique of the Erfurt program, and that it was edited in such a way to read as, well, now Engels has said the working class can no longer come to power through the barricade form. Therefore, he means we have to use parliamentary means. And this was a distortion. And Engels said, it's a distortion, and that, 10 times to 1, there's going to be violent resistance. And, when there's violent resistance, we need to be in a position to win. And then I'd say to that, the way you win people to your side is by working for the democratic republic.
Thank you, comrade. We've got a few people with their hands up. Comrades, if you have a question, a comment, please do come in. We are friends here. If you didn't understand something, please come in to ask or to contribute to this. The first person with the hand up was Matthew Jones. So if you could please switch on your camera. And then Kevin and Luke, whenever you want to reply, you can reply after each speaker or, at the end, whatever you prefer. Hi, Matthew.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue, there's a few issues in here. I mean, first, the first thing really is it is a question of class power. I mean, the problem with it, the formulation is the prime question really is which class actually holds power. And the question of a dictatorship of proletariat merely means that the proletariat takes power and suppresses the ruling class, the capitalist class. It has to do that. It's just a precondition of everything else. As we can see from the Commune, the fact they didn't suppress their enemies actually led to the fact that they were butchered after 100 days or so. That's the point. I think that the thing is, obviously, I mean, the Commune was clearly incredibly important to Marx and Engels because obviously they theorized all this stuff, and suddenly you actually have the importance of Commune, of course, is it's the first time the working class actually takes power anywhere, is the point, and it's actually then for Marx and Engels to see what they've been working on actually take place in front of them is obviously incredibly important. I mean, it's a different thing than saying, okay, well, I've completely different from 1848, in which there wasn't a clear working class pole. Suddenly you have this issue, and however inadequately and however unclearly, and for whatever issues there were with the political forces involved. I mean, there were members of the First International who were communards. You know, that was the point. They were actually participating live in this live event and in issuing critiques day by day and corresponding with people and so on. And it, you know, incredibly important in terms of political development. But I think it's also in terms of looking at it. You know, Marx moves after 1848. In 1850, he starts talking and theorizing about permanent revolution, which is actually to say, you know, or revolution in permanence, i.e., that the democratic tasks historically of the capitalist class, they are now fallen the working class, because the capitalist class will use any form of autocracy or feudalism or whatever else, you know, against the working class, and will not actually fulfill what you can say is it may see as its own historic tasks, and therefore those things fall upon the working class. And this is, you know, the important question, that the whole only liberation class left is the working class. I think the thing is, the other thing that Marx states is that the working class cannot merely lay hold of the existing machinery of state, and that's incredibly important. That takes out all of that stuff from the SPD. He just says you can't, and he's quite right, absolutely right, and it absolutely bears repeating now over and over and over again, because if you look at all the machinery of the state and all the bits of capitalist democracy, all of these things serve the ruling class, whether that's the parliament or the machinery of the state or the local councils. All of these things are actually set up to serve the enemy class, which means that you can use that, you can speak in them and you can use them to a degree, but they are not open to the working class. They're not part of the working class. They are, you know, they have to be treated in that way, and that's profound. You know, and stands to this day. I think the other thing was also the fact that obviously the other thing about the Commune, of course, is it didn't touch the banks, which is always an issue when it comes to these. You know, the Bank of France was left completely untouched. Also a question for the Spanish Revolution and other things. You know, these are always quite central in terms of, you know, how do you deal with finance capital, and that part of class power. The final point I think that is important is also that obviously, as people say, the revolutions have a long wind. You know, a serious revolution has a long wind, and the Commune had a huge effect, massive effect. It terrified the life out of the ruling class. They quit. I mean, you know, they understood that the working class was here on the stage. It caused a 20-year depression. It caused things like the stampede for Africa, all this stuff, the restructure of imperialism. You know, the ruling class quite clearly understood that they would be, you know, that this thing was suddenly on the stage, and they had to do something. And they you know, it caused this huge question. And of course, it inspired the left, and obviously it was, the lesson was taken very strongly by the Bolsheviks and others. So, you know, in those terms, a really important event. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Luca, Kevin, do you want to respond to anything? I mean, the question of the state is interesting, and we will be discussing this further on in the series, because Marx famously wrote, you know, about the withering away of the state, and that is an interesting discussion, because now he's saying it needs to be smashed. The bourgeois state needs to be smashed, and then I believe he develops it into the proletarian state that develops the democratic republic that then will have to wither away and towards communism. That's how you see it?
I can say just briefly, although I think what I'll say now, you know, will probably come up again. The Democratic Republic, you know, is not simply taking over the existing state. I think if we look at what it means in concrete form, it approaches, and this is why I call it actually smashing the state. That's how much it is not simply taking over the existing state, especially when it comes to the bureaucracy and the standing army, which is what Marx and Engels focused on when they were talking about the state first and foremost. The other point, you know, in which I agree is that yes, the bourgeoisie is not going to create the Democratic Republic. That is a project for the working class. And that finally, the issue with the Paris Commune was not that it didn't, wasn't repressive enough, or didn't, it was too democratic, so to speak. So it didn't have effective leadership, for one thing. And that for those other reasons, the certain flaws didn't turn out, let alone the context. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Ian's next.
Good evening, comrades, and thank you to Matthew, because you made many of the points I was going to make. So just wanted to add, as far as I'm concerned, when Marx and Engels saw the Commune, that changed everything. It changed the perception of what workers' demands should be. No more really could we be demanding an extension of bourgeois democracy. It was the end of the matter. We couldn't. So when Marx and Engels speak approvingly of the democratic republic, it's the situation in which workers can most effectively operate, rather than the thing that will replace capitalism, or the thing that will replace the bourgeois state. The Commune, as far as I see, transformed everything, but of course they were also critical of the communards. I mean, it has to be remembered that the majority of the political leadership of the communards were actually followers of Proudhon and some of Bakunin, and so understandably we're very critical of them. I mean, as Matthew's already pointed out, just the fact that they mounted a guard in front of the Bank of France rather than seize the whole wretched thing. And also has to be remembered that Marx was aware of the potential consequences of this failing, because he cautioned against seizing power, but then said, once you've done it, well bloody well march on Versailles then, and don't stand behind your barricades. Engels understood perfectly well that the barricade was a useless form of defensive warfare, and certainly couldn't be employed for anything other than defensive warfare. So the point about old familiar democratic litany, I think, is because the Goethe program was full of the kind of platitudes that we tend to see in social democratic parties today about freedom and fairness and those kinds of things. And it's the democratic litany is the democratic litany of the bourgeoisie. And remember, this word democratic has meant different things at different times. Marx and Engels would have been fully aware of the democracy of ancient Greece, of the democracy of the Roman Senate, and fully aware, of course, that they had been superseded, and that bourgeois democracy needed to be superseded further. And I think that's the whole point, and that's why the Paris Commune is such a seminal moment. I mean, you could even raise the question, well, hang on a minute, is Engels talking about it as, if you want to see if you want to see the socialism in action, as it were, you look at the Paris Commune. If you want to see the proletarian dictatorship, look at the Paris Commune. But actually, of course, many of the communards were not proletarians, but artisans of one sort or another, not necessarily. But that's not the point. The point is that it's not just as kind of a sociological question about who are the people involved. It's a question about the demands are at the heart of what it would be necessary for the proletariat to do in order to bring about socialism. And crucially, we always have to remember that every one of us will be slaughtered if we don't get this right. I have no wish to go the way of Salvador Allende. I have no wish to go, or any number of other people, Che Guevara or whoever else, it just does not get this right. There's a lot at stake. And therefore, I think the point about the Commune is that it goes way beyond bourgeois democracy, goes beyond the democratic state, the democratic republic. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Steve Freeman.
Comment on Ian's last point before I get back to the main thing and what Luke said. the point about Chile and Allende was Allende didn't put forward a program for a democratic republic. He said, we're already in this republic. What's the problem? Let us abide by the Constitution. And while he was abiding by the Constitution, the armed forces smashed him out the park. That's what happened. He never put forward, he never set out to democratize Chile and mobilize on that basis for a democratic republic, including his big mistake over the armed forces. So there's the lesson, Ian, of what happens if you don't have a democratic Republican approach and you simply go along with using the existing state, the police, the bureaucracy, the security services, and all the rest of it. And I want to say, first of all, Luke, fantastic presentation, I thought, and I'm totally in agreement. I think just about with everything you said. I'm sure that kind of thing is something I disagreed with, but you highlighted some important points. First of all, the Democratic Republic. And I was talking about Republican communists, are those who believe that the existing state must be replaced by a democratic republic, as opposed to the anarcho-communists, Bakunin and others, who simply want to abolish the state. And you saw how those anarcho-communists were operating in the Paris Commune, by the way. And whereas Marx was the emphasis on, as it were, the democratic republic. And the democratic republic is what the minimum program is about, as comrades have already said. It's in the slogan of the Communist Party of Germany. It's discussed again in the Erfurt and Gotha programs. It's in the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. And I do know that Lenin said at one point, and I think it was, I don't have this quote to hand, but I've certainly seen it, and maybe I'll be able to find it at some point. Around about 1920, he said maybe the minimum program is dead because we've kind of won. But if we lose, he said, if we lose, we'll need the minimum program to come back again. Because if we lose, we've lost the Democratic Republic, therefore the case for the Democratic Republic comes back on board. And he was quite prescient, in my view, on making that point. Naturally, I have a lot of sympathy with that slogan at the end where it says, Marx says, I have repeated ad nauseum for 40 years the importance of the Democratic Republic. Now, I can't speak anywhere about the Democratic Republic going, people come and saying, we've heard you say that for about 40 years, you know what I mean? So I have some, obviously, sympathy with Marx and Engels over that. I think, and there's another point that's probably missing with the Paris Commune, so I want to say this. If Charles Windsor abdicated tomorrow and they called this a democratic republic, it wouldn't be. It would just be the constitutional monarchy without a head of state. And really, it's not an event becoming a republic. It's a process of struggle that begins with the fall of the old regime. And when the old regime has fallen, then the struggle begins. So really, to understand the story of the Paris Commune, you've got to go back to 1870. What happened when Emperor Louis Napoleon was defeated at Sedan, and a group of workers actually forced their way into the National Assembly, this is 1870, and demand a republic. I mean, it was the working class who invaded the National Assembly and demanding that they announce a republic. And then they carried off a group of Republican deputies, MPs. They carried them off to the Hotel de Ville on the 4th of September, 1870. In the name of the people, they said, you know, we now proclaim, as it were, the Third Republic. Now, that proclamation of the Third Republic wasn't the end of the story, was it? It was the fact that once that happened, then you got a split within that Republican movement with Thiers on one side and the Paris Commune. So the thing kept evolving and kept struggling, and out of it came the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune came out of the fall of Louis Napoleon and the declaration of the Third Republic. So that's why we have to think of the process of struggle that goes on. And you can see the same thing, of course, in Russia. The fall of the Tsar in February 1917 is not the end of the story. You know, they all go home at that point. It's just the beginning of a struggle for a democratic republic, which you can say doesn't really happen until the Soviets come to power in October. And I make one other point, well, two other points, Tina. I think it was a very interesting point about the litany of democratic demands, because the left in England has never been very interested in democracy and democratic demands. But they've now started to put forward the demand for proportional representation. And in some ways, that's you could say, well, that's good. But really, they're using it as a substitute for demanding the republic, which is what they should be demanding. And that's only part of that. So I think what you said about the litany of putting forward lots of petty democratic demands in a monarchy, as opposed to putting forward the demand for a republic, I think is really what they were what was being talked about there. So I think that point you made there, Luke, is actually relevant, an important point, relevant to how we deal with that today. And then I do want to make the final point. Lassalle, as you say, was actually, I'd call him a social monarchist. That is to say, he was so hostile to the rule of capital that he would even side himself with Bismarck and the Prussian monarchy, as you said, and support the idea of a welfare state and even state capitalism and setting up cooperatives and things of this type. These reforms, it's not that much different, I mean, to the programme of Jeremy Corbyn, which was really arguing for those social reforms under a constitutional monarchy. And that's the big weakness that we still have on the left in England. We just don't understand or get the Republican question. And I think you've contributed, I'll finish it. You and Kevin, by the way, have contributed, and Tina, we won't keep Tina on this, have contributed to making this case why the left must take seriously the question of republicanism. Not because we've invented it, is because Marx and Engels developed those ideas back at the beginning in the 19th century.
Thanks, Steve. Kevin or Luke, anybody want to come back to any of the last speakers?
No, I'll come back after a couple more comrades.
Okay. Anne is the last person with a hand up. Comrades, if anybody else has a question or would like to make a comment, please click raise hand. Okay, hi Anne.
Hi. So a couple of people have raised the question of whether the United States is a democratic republic or the British state is a democratic republic, or whether the bourgeoisie are democratic. In my view, the question of democracy needs to be considered from the point of view of the working class and its struggle for its rights. So therefore, I believe that the bourgeoisie are not democratic. Obviously, they're ruling as a minority over the majority of society. So they're implicit in that is the fact that they're clearly not democratic. What they are willing to do under certain circumstances is to allow certain democratic rights to exist. And most of that has to do with the strength of the working class in terms of imposing its demands through struggle. So sorry, there's a cat just jumped up behind me there. Then I just wanted to talk about the form of the democratic republic. And sometimes, you know, when we're talking about this question, I feel a little bit like we're talking about something in a way that we want to find out exactly what Marx and Engels meant by it. And we're trying to put ourselves in their minds. And I think that sometimes that's, that's really like not going to lead to anywhere. Yes, of course, we look at what was happening in the sense of the Paris Commune and what they meant by that. But then I think that for us, it's more important to look at our most recent example of revolution in the Soviet Union. Well, really, I mean, in the early Russian Republic, because whereas the Paris Commune, and I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't discuss this question, but I mean, I'm talking about like examples in the early stages of the Russian Revolution, I think are more valuable to us, because while firstly, the Paris Commune is at a much earlier stage in history when the bourgeoisie are in a much less prominent position in society, and there is this concept that they may have some progressive potential. By 1917, I don't think that that's the situation. Internationally, the bourgeoisie are seen by communists as not having any progressive potential. They've engaged in a murderous war, and those like the provisional government in Russia who have put themselves forward as progressive reformists of some kind have proved themselves to be warmongers. But so I wanted to just put forward the experience of Alexandra Kollontai. She was commissar for welfare in the early Russian revolutionary state. So she was appointed in 1917, and she actually stayed in the position, I think, for about a year, and she resigned over Brest-Litovsk because she was a leftist. But anyway, in her position as commissar, she complained about the fact that she had to deal with the existing staff. So she wasn't in a position, or they weren't in a position, to sack all of the existing experts, but she was trying to use this institution to enact a very different program to the one that had existed before it. So in other words, this was a mass democratic program to provide social welfare, to set up nurseries and other forms of socialized provision. So like it wasn't designed for that purpose, but it was the existing establishment. And they weren't really in a position, and I don't think we would be in a position either, of completely casting aside those forms. I think we would have to try to use them to progress our aims. And I also think that we would have to retain experts, because the working class, even if we're in a position of the working class being extremely sophisticated and knowledgeable and able and all of those things, it still won't have had access to power until such time as it makes revolution. So I think that myself, that, you know, all you can really say is that the working class comes to power and it fights to implement its program as opposed to conciliate with the existing state. But I think the manner in which it deals with the existing state very much depends on the circumstances. And I think that smashing, to me, always appears as though it's some kind of an anarchist tactic, and also that it's something that destroys everything that already exists, rather than what I would believe to be a better way to put it, that it uses whatever exists to put in place to implement the working class program. So the working class program will be implemented despite the limitations of that state. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Anne. I've got a few people now with their hand up. John Fitzgerald, I think you have problems with your camera, so you can just speak now. John Fitzgerald, you can speak now if you like.
Yes, hi.
Hello.
You're all hear me.
Yes, we can now.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I thought the last two speakers made some very, very good points. I've just read this book, putting flesh and blood on all this. The Voices of the Paris Commune is a book which actually basically tells you, is actually writing about the people who are actually involved in it. The people who who died, and so on and so on. So there's and I kind of just feel that the commune itself, as Steve said, came out of the the defeat of one of the Napoleons. And it wasn't really, it didn't seem to me to be a what you would call a crisis to bring on a revolution as such. I mean, when we look at France today, what do we see there? At the moment, it's about pay. Can it go further? Can it actually start questioning the constitution and so on? Where will that lead? Again, it's France, but the book itself is rather sad, really, because a majority of them, so many of them die, although a lot of them do carry on their lives, and many of them, carry on either being socialists, anarchists, and so on. A lot of them are exiled, a lot of them are executed, and it gives them names, so it kind of puts blood and flesh on this, the actual Paris Commune itself. So I'm kind of I'm learning tonight things around because on the one hand you've got the idea of a revolution, as Marx says, or Lenin, Trotsky, whatever. They say a crisis doesn't make a revolution. The revolution got to be made by the class, the working class. Kind of quite right. But what happened here, as I said, what the actual root of it was, it wasn't, say, like a Bolshevik party or something, was it? It was a reaction to a defeat, Napoleon, whatever. And so I'm asking myself, really, is there any real link in terms of what we could say, with the Bolshevik Party and the Paris Commune, who actually kind of, very naively stood around for 100 days debating as to whether they let their hostages go or not, and all disagreed with each other and so on, whilst the army was outside, gathering. So I'm just throwing things out there, really. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Next person is Jill Schaefer, please. Gil, sorry.
Hi there. About the Democratic Republic and Marx and Engels. History didn't start with Marx and Engels. They were Democrats before they were socialists, and they got their democracy from the American and French revolutions. Lenin's article, The Three Sources and whatever of Marxism, English economics, French revolutionary politics, and German philosophy. Of those three, the Democratic Republic is the only thing that Marx and Engels didn't modify. Engels says in his critique of the effort program that the Great French Revolution proved what the form of the state the working class should adopt. So my attitude towards Marx and Engels is not that they introduced, not everything they introduced was new, or not everything they supported was new. And I actually see them in a longer history of the struggle for democracy that goes back at least 400 years to the Levelers. And so the question is, well, what did Marx and Engels add? Well, I don't think they added that the revolution would be inevitable. They did say that at times, but I think that's can be ignored. I don't think that's valuable at all. What they added is that they saw something developing within industrial capitalism that would create a social force that would have the power to finally introduce democracy, to finally society get control of itself, self-government. Okay, but that was an ambition long before Marx and Engels. So I think we need to change a perspective on that. And in addition, I'll just add, I mean, I'm from the United States. All of these issues are absolutely alive for us. The power of the US empire, I see a lot of discussions going on in Britain. How can we get socialism? How can we get democracy? Well, you are living, as a vassal of the US empire. Back in the 60s and 70s, the Chinese proposed the United Front Against Imperialism. Well, we still need a united front against the United States imperialism. And a big prop to that imperialism is our undemocratic constitution. I mean, we're subject to, we don't have democratic rights. If you compare the US electoral system even to Britain, I mean, you have nothing like our Supreme Court. You have nothing like our Senate. You can see some of the things that are going on with these court decisions that I don't think anyone, I mean, Macron tried to get away with something similar, and you can see, the opposition growing there. France is probably the least democratic major country in Europe, but we are so much worse that the issue of the Democratic Republic for us is primary. Anyway, so I just wanted to add that. It's just an incredibly important issue. Marx and Engels didn't invent it. We've been fighting for it for hundreds of years, and the struggle is still going on.
Thank you, comrade. Paul, please.
Okay, here I am. Yes, yesterday's Morning Star is relevant to current day. The lady, Marilyn Warbis, said monarchists aren't necessarily bad, because they're talking about the fact that, or implying the fact that we would appear to be ruled by people in Washington or Langley, and our head of state doesn't actually have much say in that. So perhaps we ought to encourage our head of state, who has years of education and the privilege of rule, to sit back and look at things. Perhaps we should encourage him to look at our relationship with Langley, and can he do anything about it, or will the powers that be just assassinate him? Just a question.
Thank you. Caroline, please.
Thank you. My question is in the context of democracy, and thanks to speakers. And I think it was Luke who said that we can't, the working class, we've got to really, what is meant by democracy? We can't have the working class, a section of the working class ruling over another section of the working class. So, and I did have a look through the Gotha program today, and I think Marx in that, he says that in the workers' democracy, that women would have to, we'd have to be careful that women didn't do work that wasn't suitable for them, basically. I don't know whether he meant for our bodies or what. I know it's a different environment then, completely, obviously. Also, he said, I think he said something about we'd have to watch how many hours, or be careful about how many hours women did, something like that. Now, I think I've heard in other sessions, and I don't think the Paris Commune included suffrage for women. And I want to know whether Marx and Engels' democracy included suffrage for women, Did they treat women differently? And if they did, in reference to what I said about the Gotha program, did he still consider women to be, Marx and possibly Engels, to be the supportive class that would support men by doing all the childcare and any caring, work in the house, etc. So I'm just wondering if there's an element of that I'd like to know, because the question of democracy and a certain section of the working class ruling over another section of the working class has been brought up today. I know we have a women's, and I'm really looking forward to Anne's session next week, but I think it's relevant to this session in the democracy question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Minnie, but yes, I think the Paris Commune made huge strides forwards for women, but I'm sure Luke and Kevin will get back to that. Ken is our next person, last person to speak from the floor. If there's anybody else, otherwise we'll just get that last person out and then have Kevin and Luke sum up.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Can you hear me? Hello?
Sorry, yes.
Yes, okay. A brief question, which may be one you'd prefer to take in a later session, and it basically hinges on the question of power without tyranny. Does Luke believe that the measures he put up in that table would mitigate against the inevitability of any state ultimately becoming a tyranny, and that ultimate may, I think, happen in a very short space of time? I'm not proposing a solution or even necessarily an alternative to it, but I think if you look at practically all history, all states in the end become tyrannies, and sometimes very quickly become tyrannies. But perhaps that's a question for your later session on the state. One other thing to mention, Anne McShane mentioned Alexandra Kollontai, and I'm sure Anne is probably aware, but others may not be. There's a podcast on Alexandra Kollontai called AK-47 because it deals with 47 pieces by or about Alexandra Kollontai, and it's done by Kristen Godsey, who's the author of Red Valkyries that came out recently. But on the question of power without tyranny, I'd be interested in the panel's views on that, if not in this session, perhaps in a later one. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Steve wants to comment briefly. Another bite of the cherry.
Yeah, just very, very quickly, just to say, Tina, I just want to tell comrades that on May the 6th, just relevant, there is going to be a demonstration in Trafalgar Square from 10 o'clock. It's the coronation day. So all Republicans, if you're around in London, do come to Trafalgar Square and join the protest there. And I will make one other political point. If you had, just very, very quickly, if you had a democratic republic in the way that Luke outlined, where the Paris Commune was, it wouldn't survive like that if the economy was privately owned by big capital. I mean, it could only survive by extending itself into the areas of ownership of property. If it didn't do that, the property owners would overthrow it straight away. So if you had a democratic republic, it would be a giant step towards a social republic. You'd have to take that next step. You couldn't not do that. But the point about picking out the democratic republic, it's the route to be able to do that. You need the power of the democratic republic to be able to extend that into the property question without hiding it, of course. I'm not saying it's 2 stages really, but just to see how it rolls over. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Steve. We should say that demonstration is organized by Republic. Is that right?
That's organized. It is organized by Republic, but we're going to go there and we'll have our own. We'll send leaflets around in a minute. It's very shortly, PDF, so give details from the Republican Labour Working Group, Republican Labour Education Forum. We'll do that.
Because Republic is one of those bourgeois campaigns that literally only fights for the end of the monarchy. And wants an elected head of state, etc., president, so they're useless. But they've been doing good protest in the last few weeks. It's good to see that wherever Charles goes, there's somebody holding up a banner, not my king, but we could come with our own banners.
I mean, if the left had been doing its own thing on this, by the way, we wouldn't have to tail along with that, but they're the only people who've been doing anything. So that we're going to go where the action is, and they're the ones who are creating most of the action, unfortunately, because the left hasn't done that.
Okay,
That's our weakness and failure.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Okay, Kevin and Luke, maybe 10 minutes each, or however you want to divide it up.
Well, I'll just come back for a few moments because I think Luke, you know, had the burden of the contribution. So I really wanted to start with I suppose something that Steve has just said about the way that that grouping republic poses the idea of the republic, and it's really run through quite a lot of the discussion as to what we actually mean by democracy and what we mean by republic. And I'm very struck because I've spoken about this topic in a number of fora, and there are comrades who are, you know, involved in this meeting that I've, you know, discussed this with. And it's the sort of absence of really an understanding of what those words mean. And Gil correctly put them in an historical context, which, you know, I and Luke also tried to do. I think the problem is that if we think of the Republic in the way that you might in sort of everyday conversation, I mean, if I had £1 for every time, if I advocate a democratic republic, someone says, well, you'll end up like America, or you'll end up like France, or, you know, it will end up in some other corrupt or inefficient or plainly dictatorial system. And I think what the left has not done, and has not done for a very long time, is to frame it in the way that Luke has done and has drawn from Marx and Engels and also from Lenin, is to frame what we mean by a democratic republic. Because when Engels says that the democratic republic is the form of rule of the working class, he's not talking about Macron's republic. He's not talking about the republic in the United States. He's talking about the type of demands that Bruno Leopold had raised coming out of the Commune, but in particular the demands for the real democratization of society, you know, and that is the form of rule. So points about democracy, about the abolition of the state bureaucracy, about the abolition of the standing army, these are not just points of you know, organization. They point really to the nature of class power, and above all, the creation of a state that is then the way for the working class to rule, and indeed to then act as the ruling class and to suppress opposition to that rule. So I think that in just using the term democratic republic, or phrasing it in bourgeois terms, as many people have done, it's very easy to dismiss. And I think it's very common now on the left not to want to discuss you know, the nature of what that phrase republicanism actually means. You know, too often we phrase our socialism in terms of economic demands, and what we tend to do is to leave off democratic demands, other than perhaps a reference to Soviets, which of course everybody's in favor of. So we simply say we want a Soviet republic, or we favor Soviets. But what that actually means, particularly say in terms of the abolition of the standing army, is very rarely taken up. In particular, the idea of republicanism not just being about institutional forms, but about a type of rule, about self-government, self-administration, and to take the phrase from the German, extreme democracy, the full democratization. So that when, for example, we talk about the election of judges, and we talk about the abolition of the armed bodies of the state, that is, you know, that is a form of democracy which many people on the left won't countenance, or is simply too awkward for them to countenance. So when we're talking about a republic, we're not talking about a president or indeed a monarchy as such. We're talking about the nature of power, who wields that power. And again, much of the discussion in Britain in particular is taken up not with the realities of the power, but the forms of that power, and particularly the concentration of it in a, you know, in a bourgeois state. The other aspect of republicanism, which again Marx and Engels, drawing on that tradition that Gil is talking about, is the argument of is the argument of, I suppose, revolutionary consciousness and of self-government. If we are going to have this democratic republic, that will require the development of a much greater, much higher form of political consciousness to maintain that republic, to organize it, to maintain its rule. Isn't just a case of voting, isn't just a case of acceptance of forms. It's about real self-government. In other words, it's a revolutionary socialist consciousness, which I think will both help to create that republic, but will also then be developed by it. And again, in not fully understanding what we mean by democracy and not understanding the conception of republic, we tend to just stick with bourgeois conceptions. Again, if we look at the sort of the programs that Luke has outlined, we can see that it goes much further than that. And I think that's the importance of discussions like this. Anyway, I'll let Luke wind up now. I've spoken for far too long.
Thank you, Kevin. Very good point. We have to fill the slogan of Democratic Republic with content. I also thought it's worthwhile reminding people that the Labour Party in its first program in 1900 actually called for the abolition of the standing army and for a civilian militia, which much of the left can't, finds totally impossible, ridiculous to call for a people's militia. It means self-defense of ourselves. That's really all it means, and it means taking the weapons out of the hand of the professional army against us. Anyway, Luke, please, over to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin and Tina, and thanks everyone for your comments and questions. I'll pick up maybe on something Kevin said, and it's kind of funny because, it's one of these things, you swear you read it in a book somewhere and it's quite profound, and then you go back and you try and find it in the book and you can't find it. So you never know if it's just it sounds too good to be true. So you think, well, I must have made it up, but then you think, oh, I must have found it in a book. Anyways, it's this idea that either Marx or Engels had a critique of the communards, but it was mostly a critique of their Bakuninist and kind of Lassallean kind of influence, as we've talked about, saying that one of the reasons things didn't work out well was because they hadn't been engaged in politics prior to the Paris Commune. So if I can find that reference where that takes place, great. But I think that speaks again to this idea of it's the engagement in politics, it's the engagement in struggle for the Democratic Republic, and this idea that the running of society will become the responsibility of the working class. And until that fully develops, the keeping account of at least the folks who do run society will be the responsibility of the working class. So yes, it will take a degree of consciousness and responsibility, I think, that needs to be developed and has to be developed through struggle that's engaged in politics and through a certain lens. So I took a few notes here, and I think what I'm really going to do is maybe just answer a few and then kind of end by emphasizing some points that I thought were especially prescient. In regards to the power and power becoming tyranny in some sense, that's why I think Bakunin's perspective is an interesting piece, because here you have someone expressing that anxiety and Marx reacting to it. And my response to that is, well, I think these are the measures that give us the best chance. And I hesitate to say that, well, all states until this point, perhaps, and yet, we have yet to achieve an actual democratic republic. And so, I think there is reason to hope in that regard. In regards to a few comments on Allende, I think that an important lesson to take from that is the adherence to the existing state and adherence to the existing constitution. And I think at least here in the US, if folks want to defend the existing constitution, while I can understand why they would, the burden of proof is on them, so to speak, as to how that doesn't set one up for an Allende type situation. Maybe not exactly, but the importance of breaking with those structural changes. let's see. Is the US a democratic republic? I think folks have touched on this, but one thing I can just kind of add is, I was doing a quick Control F search here in the critique of the Gotha program. And the US isn't even a democratic republic by the standards of those old democratic litany that Marx says is familiar to all. Universal suffrage, there are a lot of folks in the US who can't vote. Direct legislation, not so much. Popular rights, all of those movements were co-opted or kind of crushed in various ways. A people's militia, we don't have it, etc. I can't exactly infer what exactly he would mean by etc., though I have to also think that it would be some things that we actually have yet to achieve. So it's in that sense that I think we can kind of critique to what extent folks had, I hesitate to say illusions in the United States, but we know that the United States was upheld as a state form in which the working class could, in theory, come to power peacefully. And I think what that says is that the idea that the US is a democratic republic presents this idea of here is an example in which by winning this struggle for a particular demand, certain possibilities are opened up in those states that are not opened up in other countries. And I think we also have to keep in mind, of course, what I already said about Engels, which is the recognition that no ruling class is going to simply hand over power to someone else. And then I'll say two more things. One, the women in the Paris Commune. It's correct that women were not given the right to vote in the Commune. And as other folks I think have mentioned in the chat, a lot of women did very important things. And there's an entire kind of yet to be developed or in the process of being developed history of women in the Paris Commune. For what it's worth in terms of saying a book title in a presentation, surmounting the barricades, is an interesting book that touches on that question. And I guess lastly, talking about how this feeds into the Russian Revolution, which I think is interesting and obviously too big of a topic for us to cover. But after taking state power, the Russian revolutionaries are, I think, grappling with what do we really do now in a certain sense. And a lot of them are turning to Lenin's State and Revolution, which is then drawing back on earlier works. And I think there's something to be learned in examining that period and saying, what things can we imagine working in these very chaotic situations and what things might not work, even if we think that ideally they're the best thing. Because I agree, it's serious stuff, even though the revolution seems far away. But I think because of that, there are lessons we can learn in terms of what can we do in revolutionary situations that go beyond, kind of fixed ideas or whatnot. And I think democracy in the Democratic Republic is, can offer us a lot in that regard. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think we had a good look at the issue of democracy, not uncontroversial on the left, but I think it's important that we reclaim that context, that concept, and fill it with concrete content to make sure that we go beyond saying, all we need to do is get rid of the monarchy or abolish the House of Lords, etc. That's not the kind of democracy we are talking about. Luke did reply to your question on the Paris Commune and the women, and we'll be looking at it again in next week's session on what Marx, Engels, and other Marxists had to say on the women's questions and how they fought for women's liberation. That's going to be next week, and then we're going to have the week after, we're going to have a session on the First International, and then we're actually having a session that we've just pushed in, which is on the monarchy, Marx and the monarchy. We thought it'd be very interesting to have on the 2 days before the coronation to have a session on what Marx said on that issue. Obviously getting rid of it, but he had a bit more to say on that question. Thank you very much, comrades, for attending tonight, and we'll see you next week, hopefully. Good night. Bye-bye.